Okay, so like when we talk about really bad stuff from history, like Hitler's Nazi Germany, like the worst of the worst, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So is it even fair to ask, like, can we compare that to modern right-wing parties, like the ones we see today in democracies, like the Conservative Party over in the UK or Canada, or like the Republicans in the US?
Right. It seems kind of wild to even think about, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today here on Dansplain.
Yeah, pretty big topic.
It is. And we are not trying to make this, like a lighthearted thing or anything. This is serious stuff.
Absolutely.
But we want to understand, like, what are the real differences and similarities, between these totalitarian dictatorships like Hitler and Stalin, and then like modern right-wing parties, like I said, that are working within democratic system. So we're going to like go step by step through all this info.
Yeah, we've got a lot to cover, but hopefully we can break it down in a way that's like clear and engaging.
I think so. Okay, so where should we start? Maybe like let's just lay out the basics of what Hitler's Nazi regime was all about, right? We're talking about Germany from 1933 to 1945. So like what was their main ideology?
Yeah, so their ideology was essentially fascism, right? And like at the core of that, you've got this super extreme nationalism, this like belief that Germany was superior to all other nations. And then they also had this really dangerous idea of racial superiority, like the Aryan race being the master race.
And they were totally against both democracy and communism, right?
Oh, yeah. They completely rejected both systems. They saw them as like threats to their vision of a strong and racially pure Germany.
So like how did they actually rule Germany? What was it like for people living under their control?
It was a total dictatorship. Hitler was the Führer, the supreme leader, and the Nazi Party was like the only game in town. No other political parties were allowed.
So basically, if you disagreed with them, you were in big trouble.
Yeah, any kind of opposition was met with brutal force. I mean, people were imprisoned, exiled, or even killed, just for speaking out against the regime.
And how did their economic system work?
So it was a weird mix. They didn't totally get rid of private businesses, but the state had ultimate control over everything.
So like kind of like a puppet show where the businesses were the puppets?
Yeah, kind of. They directed all the economic activity towards, achieving their national goals, which at that time was mainly getting ready for war, building up the military and stuff. Historians often call this system state capitalism or corporatism because it's like private companies working for the state, not really for free market competition.
It's like the government was the CEO of the entire country.
Pretty much. And then when it came to their social policies, well, it's a really dark chapter.
Yeah, like we all know about the Holocaust, right? That's like the most horrific example of their brutality.
Yeah, it was the systematic persecution and murder of millions of people, mainly Jews, but also other groups they considered undesirable. It's like one of the worst crimes against humanity in history.
And it wasn't just the Holocaust, right? They had all these other awful policies.
Oh, yeah. I mean, women were basically forced into these traditional roles, like staying home and raising children.
Yeah.
And anyone who spoke out against the regime was sent to concentration camps, where they were tortured and killed. It was a truly terrifying time to be alive, especially if you didn't fit into their narrow view of what a German citizen should be.
So basically their whole goal was to gain power, national power, racial power, and of course Hitler's own personal power.
Right, and democracy was seen as an obstacle to that, something weak and ineffective. They had zero respect for individual rights or freedoms.
Okay, so that was Nazi Germany, a far-right totalitarian state. Now let's switch gears and talk about Stalin and the Soviet Union, which lasted from the late 1920s to 1953, right?
Yeah, so Stalin's regime was built on communism, at least that's what they said.
But communism is supposed to be about equality and sharing, right? Not like dictatorship.
It's in the idea, but the way Stalin put it into practice was anything but equal. I mean, it was a super authoritarian system with him at the top calling all the shots and crushing anyone who questioned him.
So was it actually communist or just Stalin using that as an excuse?
It's a complicated question.
Yeah.
I mean, he used the language of communism, talking about creating a classless society and all that. But in reality, he just created a super centralized state with him as the all-powerful leader. He basically twisted the ideals of communism to serve his own agenda.
So even though communism is supposed to be stateless in the end, Stalin ended up making a really, really powerful state.
Yeah, it's one of those ironic twists of history.
Oh, yeah.
The whole point of communism is to get rid of the state, but what often happens is you just end up with an even more powerful state than before.
So how did Stalin actually govern the Soviet Union?
Well, it was a lot like Nazi Germany in terms of its structure.
Yeah.
It was totalitarian, meaning the state controlled every aspect of life.
Mm.
The Communist Party was supreme, and Stalin was like the ultimate authority. No one could challenge him.
And just like in Nazi Germany, if you disagreed with Stalin, you were in deep trouble.
Yeah, dissent was absolutely not tolerated. I mean, even the slightest criticism could land you in the Gulag, those infamous forced labor camps, or you could be executed. There was like this constant atmosphere of fear and suspicion.
How about the economy? Was it similar to Nazi Germany's system?
It was different in the sense that the Soviet economy was completely nationalized. The government owned and controlled everything, all the industries, the land, the resources, you name it. There's no private enterprise at all.
So totally opposite from the capitalist system.
Yeah, exactly. And to try to rapidly industrialize the country, Stalin launched these 5-year plans, which were these like super ambitious goals for economic growth. But they were often achieved through like brutal force and with total disregard for the well-being of the people.
So what were Stalin's social policies like?
They were really focused on this idea of class struggle, like the workers versus the capitalists.
Right.
And he orchestrated these massive purges where he eliminated anyone he saw as a threat to his power.
So who did he target in these purges?
It was really broad. Anyone could be labeled an enemy of the people. I mean, wealthy peasants, who they called kulaks intellectuals, people from certain ethnic groups, anyone suspected of disloyalty to Stalin. It was basically a reign of terror.
And he also went after religion, right?
Yeah, he saw religion as like a rival to his authority. So he shut down churches, persecuted religious leaders, and promoted atheism as part of the official state ideology.
So just like Hitler, his main goal was power.
Yeah, and he used the idea of building a communist utopia as justification for all the brutality. But in the end, it was really about him staying in control.
So another dictator, another totalitarian regime, just with a different set of ideas, supposedly driving it, right?
Yeah, but it's important to remember that Stalin wasn't unique in his methods. I mean, we saw similar patterns in other left-wing dictatorships, too.
Like, who else are we talking about here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at Mao Zedong in China or Kim Il-sung in North Korea. They were all single-party states with economies dominated by the government. They all used mass repression to silence dissent, and they all had these like intense cults of personality around the leader. So it's not like Stalin was this like anomaly. It's more like he fit into a pattern of authoritarianism that we see across different ideologies.
So even though we often divide politics into left and right, it seems like when it comes to dictatorships, there are some common threads regardless of their stated ideology.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. Yeah. It makes you wonder, like, why do these seemingly opposite systems end up using such similar tactics to maintain control?
Exactly. Like, what is it about absolute power that seems to breed these kinds of methods?
I think it comes down to the fact that any totalitarian regime, whether it's coming from the left or the right, has this fundamental need to eliminate any challenge to its authority. Right? So to do that, they have to suppress dissent, they have to control information, and they have to use force to silence their opponents. It's like the logic of this dictatorship takes over, and the specific ideology becomes almost secondary.
Okay, so we've got these two brutal dictatorships, Hitler and Stalin. On the surface, they seem totally opposed, fascism versus communism. But when we look at how they actually ruled, were there more similarities than differences? Were they basically two sides of the same coin?
I mean, when you look at how they wielded power, yeah, the similarities are pretty striking.
Yeah.
I think the most fundamental one is their shared commitment to authoritarianism. Both regimes were totalitarian. They wanted to control every aspect of life, and they had zero tolerance for any kind of opposition.
So democracy was like their worst nightmare?
Basically. They saw it as weak, inefficient, and a threat to their power. So they both rejected democratic principles, like free elections, an independent press, the right to form political parties. All of that was thrown out the window.
And they both used really similar methods to stay in power, right?
Totally. I mean, both of them relied heavily on state terror. They had these massive secret police forces, the Gestapo in Nazi Germany and the NKVD in the Soviet Union. And these forces were brutal. They spied on people, they arrested people, they tortured people, they executed people. It was all about creating an atmosphere of fear so that no one would dare to challenge the regime.
And propaganda was a big part of it too, right?
Oh, yeah. They were masters of propaganda. I mean, think about those huge Nazi rallies with all the flags and the marching and the speeches. It was all carefully orchestrated to create this image of strength and unity and to glorify Hitler. And in the Soviet Union, you had all those posters and slogans everywhere, promoting Stalin as this wise and benevolent father figure.
So basically, they were manipulating people's minds, trying to control what they thought and believed.
Exactly. And of course, both regimes used forced labor camps to imprison and punish their opponents. The concentration camps in Nazi Germany and the Gulag in the Soviet Union were both places of unimaginable suffering and death.
And the leaders themselves, Hitler and Stalin, they both built up these cults of personality around themselves, right?
Oh, yeah, they were presented as these, godlike figures,
Yeah.
infallible and all-powerful. Hitler was the Führer, the savior of the German nation, and Stalin was the father of nations, this wise and caring leader who would guide the Soviet people to a brighter future.
So basically they wanted people to worship them.
Pretty much. Their images were everywhere, and everything they said was treated as gospel. It was all about reinforcing their absolute authority and crushing any potential rivals.
And even though they had different economic systems, the state was still super powerful in both cases.
That's a good point. I mean, Hitler allowed private businesses to exist, but he controlled them really tightly through regulations and by setting production targets, especially for the military. So it was like a form of state-directed capitalism. Private companies serving the interests of the state, not the free market.
And Stalin just went all out and nationalized everything, right?
Yeah, he completely abolished private property.
Right.
The state owned and controlled all the means of production, factories, farms, resources, everything. So different approaches, but the same outcome, total state domination of the economy.
And both regimes committed horrific acts of mass violence.
Yeah, this is the most chilling parallel. I mean, the Holocaust was this systematic attempt to exterminate an entire people, and the death toll was in the millions. And then you have Stalin's purges and the forced collectivization of agriculture, which led to these devastating famines. And millions of people died under his rule, too. So
Yeah.
both regimes were responsible for immense human suffering.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of cruelty.
Yeah, it's truly horrifying. But despite all these similarities, we can't ignore the fact that they had very different ideologies, right? Fascism, with its focus on race and nation, versus communism, with its emphasis on class struggle and internationalism.
Yeah, like on the surface, they seem like polar opposites.
Right, and the differences in their belief systems were real. I mean, Hitler's fascism was all about this idea of racial purity and national superiority. The Aryan race was destined to rule and everyone else was inferior, and they wanted to expand German territory and create this vast empire.
And Stalin's communism was about getting rid of class distinctions and creating a society where everyone was equal right, at least in theory.
Yeah, that was the idea. And they believed that this revolution would eventually spread throughout the world and lead to a global communist society. So very different end goals.
It's interesting, though, that despite these ideological differences, they actually signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, right? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That seems kind of strange, considering how much they supposedly hated each other.
It does seem counterintuitive. But I think it shows that when it comes to power, sometimes practical considerations can trump ideology. I mean, that pact was all about securing their own interest, even if it meant temporarily aligning with their ideological enemy. It's like a reminder that real politics, the pursuit of power, can sometimes lead to these strange bedfellows.
Yeah, it's like those memes where you see like Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man.
Exactly. It makes you question how much these ideologies really mattered to them versus just maintaining and expanding their power.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Hitler and Stalin. Now let's shift our focus to modern right-wing democratic parties. Like you said, the Conservative Party in the UK and Canada and the Republican Party in the US. So what are the main things that define these parties?
Well, they generally fall under the umbrella of conservatism, right? So they tend to emphasize things like free markets, limited government traditional values, and a strong national identity.
So like they're kind of the opposite of communism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you could say that. But it's important to distinguish between different types of nationalism. I mean, these parties often promote what's called civic nationalism, which is like pride in your country based on shared values and institutions, not on ethnicity or race.
So it's not like the Nazis who believed that Germans were racially superior.
Exactly. It's a much more inclusive form of nationalism that's based on citizenship and shared ideals.
So how do these modern right-wing parties actually operate within their countries?
Well, the key difference is that they function within democratic systems, right? So they participate in free and fair elections, they respect the rule of law, and they accept the outcomes of those elections even when they lose.
Which is something Hitler and Stalin would never have done.
No way. They would have never given up power willingly.
Yeah.
They saw democracy as a weakness.
So what about their economic policies? How do they differ from the state-controlled economies we talked about earlier?
These parties are generally big supporters of capitalism. They believe in free markets, limited government intervention, lower taxes, and things like that. So very different from the economic systems of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
And what about their social policies? Are there any similarities to what we saw under Hitler or Stalin?
Well, their social policies can vary depending on the specific party and the issues at stake, But generally speaking, they don't advocate for things like racial supremacy or class warfare, which were central to those dictatorships. They might have different views on things like traditional marriage or immigration, but they operate within a system that guarantees basic rights and freedoms to all citizens.
So it's a totally different ballgame compared to these totalitarian regimes we've been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah.
The whole foundation of their governance is different.
Okay, so when we look at the big picture, what are the main takeaways from comparing Hitler and Stalin and then comparing them to modern right-wing parties?
I think the biggest thing is that despite their ideological differences, Hitler and Stalin were both authoritarians at heart. They both rejected democracy, and they both used violence and oppression to maintain their power. So in that sense, they were more similar than different.
So their shared authoritarianism was more important than their specific beliefs.
Exactly. And then when you compare them to modern right-wing democratic parties, the contrast is even starker. I mean, these parties might have policies you disagree with, but they operate within a democratic framework that Hitler and Stalin would have completely destroyed.
So it's not even a fair comparison.
Not really. I mean, it's like trying to equate playing a game by the rules with just cheating and taking over the whole game board.
So like one of the biggest differences is their view of democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Modern right-wing parties believe in democracy. They participate in elections. They debate their ideas. They accept the results, even when they lose. Hitler, on the other hand, violently overthrew the democratic system in Germany and established a one-party dictatorship.
And then there's the whole issue of basic rights.
Yeah, democracies with right-wing parties, people generally have freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. You might not agree with what some people say, but they have the right to say it. In Nazi Germany, those rights didn't exist. You could be arrested or killed just for expressing an opinion the regime didn't like.
And even though some right-wing parties talk about nationalism, it's a very different kind of nationalism than what Hitler was promoting.
Totally. Right? It's civic nationalism, which is based on shared values and citizenship, not on ethnicity or race. And it's not about conquering other countries or establishing racial hierarchies. It's about being proud of your country and its institutions.
And their economic policies are completely different too.
Oh yeah, these modern right-wing parties believe in free markets and capitalism. They might disagree on the specifics, but they're not about having the state control the entire economy like Hitler and Stalin did.
And it's kind of ironic that the term privatization actually originated with Hitler's regime.
Right. It does seem strange that a regime known for its state control would be selling off state assets. But I guess it shows that even dictators can be pragmatic sometimes.
Right.
You know, if they need money or they want to gain support from certain groups, they might do things that seem to contradict their ideology.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that things aren't always black and white. Even the most extreme regimes can have these weird inconsistencies.
For sure. And it's also interesting to think about the scale of repression in the Soviet Union. I mean, the fact that the Gulag held over 2.5 million prisoners at its peak is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
That's more than the entire current prison population of the United States.
It's a sobering thought, and it highlights the huge difference between a democracy, even one with a right-wing party in power, and a totalitarian dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, the UK Conservative Party has been in power for a lot of the last 100 years. But every time they gained or lost power, it's been through democratic elections. Same with Republicans in the U.S. They've peacefully transferred power for over 150 years. So it's a totally different system.
Yes.
And I think it's really important to understand these differences because sometimes people make these careless comparisons between Hitler and modern politicians.
Yeah, and that's really dangerous. It trivializes the horrors of the Nazi regime, and it unfairly demonizes people who are participating in democratic politics.
It's like you're comparing someone who plays by the rules to someone who just burns the whole rule book.
Exactly. And the real link between Hitler and Stalin isn't their left-right ideology. It's their shared authoritarianism, their willingness to use violence and oppression to achieve their goals.
So the bottom line is that modern right-wing parties, even if you don't agree with their ideas, are fundamentally different from the dictatorships of Hitler and Stalin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They operate within democratic systems, they respect individual rights, and they don't engage in mass violence and repression. So yeah, it's a completely different category.
So to wrap this all up, what's the big lesson here for our listeners? What should they take away from all this?
I think the most important thing is to understand that authoritarianism is the real danger, not just whether a party or a leader is on the left or the right. I mean, both Hitler and Stalin were authoritarians, and they both caused incredible suffering. So we need to be vigilant about protecting democracy and individual rights, no matter who's in power.
And we need to be careful about making these simplistic comparisons that ignore the huge differences between democratic systems and totalitarian regimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine to criticize policies you disagree with or to hold politicians accountable, but we should never lose sight of the fact that there's a fundamental difference between someone who's trying to win an election and someone who's trying to abolish elections altogether.
That's a really important point to remember. So as you're thinking about all this stuff, we encourage you to be critical of the language you hear in political debates and to really pay attention to the differences between democratic and authoritarian systems.
And remember that democracy is precious and fragile. We need to protect it, and we need to be aware of the warning signs of authoritarianism no matter where it comes from.
That's a great message to end on. So if you found this deep dive interesting and thought-provoking, please like and subscribe to Dansplain for more in-depth discussions on all sorts of topics.
You'll be sure to check out our website at www.dansplain.xyz for all the latest episodes, articles, and more.
Thanks for listening.